The silence that followed those 5 words could have cut steel. "This is the fat pig we live with," my father announced to his poker buddies, slapping his hand on my shoulder like he was presenting a prize hog at the county fair. The laughter that erupted from his friends felt like acid in my ears. But then something shifted. One man at the table went completely still, his beer bottle frozen halfway to his mouth. His eyes locked onto something on my forearm, a small piece of black ink I rarely showed at family gatherings. Chief Petty Officer Mark Collins wasn't laughing anymore. The color drained from his face as recognition dawned. His voice cut through the room like a blade when he stood up and said those words that would change everything. "Admiral Hayes, ma'am, it's an honor." You could have heard a pin drop on that worn carpet. My father's arm fell away from my shoulders like he'd been electrocuted. The poker chips sat motionless on the table. Even the old grandfather clock in the corner seemed to pause its ticking. That was the moment 34 years of humiliation finally cracked wide open. Growing up in a split-level house 20 minutes from Norfolk Naval Base teaches you things about hierarchy that most kids never learn. In our house, Dad was the commanding officer, Mom was the executive officer, and I was somewhere between enlisted personnel and unwanted cargo. The pecking order was crystal clear, and I occupied the bottom rung. My earliest memories aren't of bedtime stories or family vacations. They're of comments that landed like small explosions at the dinner table. "Better slow down there, kiddo, or you'll eat us out of house and home." Dad would chuckle while cutting his pork chop, expecting everyone to join in. Mom would force a thin smile and change the subject. I learned to push food around my plate instead of eating it. By middle school, the jokes had evolved into a full comedy routine. "Our little piglet," he'd announce when I walked into rooms. Sometimes it was "our family's appetite on legs." The neighbors thought he was hilarious. Church friends would shake their heads and say, "Oh, that Tom and his sense of humor." Nobody ever asked how I felt about being the punchline. The worst part wasn't the words themselves, it was the way they trained everyone around me to see me as less than human. I became the family mascot, the comic relief, the thing that existed to make other people feel better about themselves. When relatives visited, they'd pat my head and say things like, "She's got such a pretty face," which everyone knew was code for shame about the rest of her. High school brought new opportunities for Dad's material. Parent-teacher conferences became performance art. "She's got a good appetite for learning," he'd tell my chemistry teacher while gesturing at my body, among other things. The teacher would laugh uncomfortably. I'd stare at my shoes until the meeting ended. But something interesting happened during those teenage years. I discovered running, not because I wanted to lose weight, though Dad made it clear that wouldn't hurt, but because it was the only time I felt like I controlled something. Those first few laps around the neighborhood were torture. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, and sweat poured down my face like rain. But when I finished, something inside me felt different, stronger, quieter. I started running at dawn before Dad woke up, before his commentary could follow me out the door. The streets were empty except for the occasional dog walker or early commuter. The silence felt like freedom. Mile by mile, day by day, I built something he couldn't touch with his words. Not speed, not necessarily, but endurance. The ability to keep going when everything hurt. Mr. Rodriguez, my junior year history teacher, noticed me running laps after school one day. He suggested I check out the JROTC program. "You've got something," he said simply. "Grit. That's worth more than most people realize." Dad laughed when I told him I was thinking about joining. "What are you going to do, march the donuts into formation?" he asked. "The military is for tough people, not—" He waved his hand at me like I was a problem that needed solving. I joined anyway. The first few weeks were brutal. I couldn't keep up with the physical training. My uniform never looked quite right. During drill practice, I stepped on my own feet more often than I stepped in time with everyone else. The other cadets whispered behind my back, probably wondering what I was doing there. Some days I wondered the same thing. But Chief Harris, the retired Navy instructor who ran the program, saw something different. He never commented on my appearance or my struggles. He focused on improvement, effort, follow-through. "Hayes," he'd say after reviewing my fitness scores, "you're getting stronger. That's what matters." It was the first time an adult man had ever spoken to me like I was worth investing in. The running that had started as escape became training. The physical challenges that had seemed impossible became achievable. Slowly, steadily, I stopped being the girl who couldn't and became the cadet who would. Not the fastest, not the strongest, but the one who wouldn't quit. That reputation meant something in JROTC. It meant something to me. Senior year brought college applications and career decisions. My classmates talked about state schools and community colleges. I talked to the Navy recruiter who visited our school every few months. She was a petty officer named Martinez, compact and direct, with eyes that seemed to see through whatever facade you were trying to maintain. "Why the Navy?" she asked during our third meeting. I thought about the question seriously. The honest answer was complicated. I wanted to serve my country, yes. I believed in something bigger than myself, absolutely. But underneath those noble motivations was something raw. I wanted to prove that the fat pig my father joked about could become something he'd never imagined, something that demanded respect instead of ridicule. "I want to lead," I told her finally. "I want to be responsible for something that matters." She studied my JROTC evaluations, my fitness scores, my academic record. Everything was solid, not spectacular but consistent. "Leadership isn't about being the loudest person in the room," she said. "Sometimes it's about being the steadiest." The night I told my parents I'd enlisted, Dad thought I was pulling some elaborate prank. "You," he said, actually choking on his coffee, "in the Navy?" The disbelief in his voice was total. "What's your job going to be, ship's cafeteria manager?" Mom looked at him sharply, one of the few times I remember her showing any disapproval of his humor. But she didn't speak up. She never did. "I ship out 2 weeks after graduation," I said quietly. The reality was starting to sink in for him. His daughter, his favorite target, was about to disappear into something he couldn't control or comment on. "They'll chew you up and spit you out," he said finally. "But I guess they feed you there, right?" Even then, even in that moment, he couldn't resist the shot about my weight. Boot camp at Great Lakes was everything they said it would be, and worse. The physical demands pushed every limit I thought I had. The mental pressure was relentless. Drill instructors screamed until their voices cracked, looking for weaknesses, testing resolve. Some recruits cracked under the pressure. Some went home. I stayed. The girl who'd grown up absorbing insults about her body learned to tune out criticism that wasn't constructive. The teenager who'd been mocked for her appetite discovered she could push through hunger, exhaustion, and pain. The daughter who'd never earned her father's respect found something better, her own. Graduation day came with dress blues, polished shoes, and a sense of accomplishment that felt foreign. My parents didn't attend. "Too far to drive," Dad said when I called to give them the details. Mom got on the phone afterward to say she was proud, but her voice was quiet, like she was afraid someone might overhear. Standing in formation that day, listening to "The Star-Spangled Banner," while families cheered from the bleachers, I realized something profound. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had earned something more valuable, the right to define myself. The Navy had given me that gift, wrapped in discipline and tied with hard work. But this story isn't really about boot camp or early assignments or the slow climb through enlisted ranks. This story is about what happened years later, when the fat pig my father had joked about walked into his living room wearing stars on her shoulders that he never knew existed. This story is about the moment his friend, a decorated Navy SEAL, recognized something my own father had been blind to for decades. Because sometimes the people who know us least are the ones who share our blood, and sometimes it takes a stranger's respect to show family members who we really are. The years between boot camp graduation and that poker game passed like pages in a book nobody in my family bothered to read. While Dad told neighbors I was playing sailor somewhere, I was learning what it meant to carry the weight of other people's lives on my shoulders. The Navy doesn't care about your childhood trauma or your father's opinion of your potential. It cares about results, reliability, and the kind of courage that shows up when everything goes sideways at 3 a.m. My first assignment was aboard the USS Independence, a carrier that felt like a floating city when you're 19 and still figuring out which end is up. I worked in communications, copying messages, and learning the rhythm of military life. The hierarchy was clear, the expectations were non-negotiable, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I fit somewhere. Petty Officer Johnson, my supervisor, was a 20-year veteran with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could cut through engine noise. He didn't care that I'd grown up being called names. He cared that I showed up on time, did my job correctly, and could be trusted when things got complicated. "Hayes," he told me after my first month, "you've got something most people don't. You listen before you talk. That'll take you places if you let it." The physical transformation came gradually. Military life has a way of reshaping you whether you're trying or not. Early morning PT, regular meals, constant activity. The body that had been the source of so much ridicule at home became something functional, strong, purposeful. I didn't lose weight to spite my father or prove a point. I got fit because the job demanded it, and slowly I began to see myself through different eyes. But the real changes were happening inside. Every successful watch, every problem solved, every crisis managed, built something my father's jokes had tried to tear down. Confidence isn't something you can fake in the military. People's lives depend on your decisions. Equipment worth millions of dollars sits under your responsibility. You either rise to meet those challenges or you wash out. I rose. 3 years into my service, I applied for Officer Candidate School. The application process was brutal, requiring recommendations, interviews, and evaluations that picked apart every aspect of your character. When the acceptance letter arrived, I called home to share the news. Mom answered, sounded genuinely pleased. Dad got on the phone and said, "Officer, huh? Guess they need someone to organize the paperwork." Even then, even when I'd earned something significant, he couldn't resist reducing it to nothing. Officer training was a different kind of challenge entirely. The physical demands were intense, but the mental pressure was what separated the wheat from the chaff. They weren't just teaching us to follow orders anymore. They were teaching us to give them, to make decisions under pressure, to lead people who might not want to be led. The girl who'd grown up being dismissed learned how to command respect through competence and character. My first command was a small logistics unit responsible for supply operations in the Mediterranean. It sounds boring until you realize that every meal, every bullet, every spare part that keeps a battle group functioning flows through logistics. Mess up the supply chain and ships go dead in the water. Get it right, and operations run so smoothly nobody notices your contribution. I chose to get it right. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Hayes, as I was known then, developed a reputation for solving problems other people couldn't figure out. When a critical parts shipment got lost between Naples and Gibraltar, I tracked it down through a maze of bureaucracy and delivered it 12 hours ahead of schedule. When a computer glitch threatened to delay fuel deliveries to 3 destroyers, I organized a manual backup system that kept everyone operational until the tech crews fixed the problem. The promotions came steadily after that. Commander, Captain, Rear Admiral. Each advancement brought new responsibilities, bigger challenges, higher stakes. I commanded logistics operations that spanned continents. I briefed Pentagon officials on supply chain vulnerabilities. I sat in meetings where decisions affected thousands of sailors and billions of dollars worth of equipment. But the most important promotion wasn't military rank. It was the invitation to join Joint Task Force 17, a unit so classified that most Navy personnel had never heard of it. The work was sensitive, dangerous, and absolutely critical to national security. The people selected for JTF 17 weren't chosen for their connections or their political savvy. They were chosen because they could be trusted with secrets that could change the course of history. The tattoo Chief Collins had spotted that night was simple, just the number 17 in small black numerals on my forearm. To most people, it looked like a sports jersey number or a lucky number. To someone with the right security clearance and operational background, it was a calling card that opened doors most people didn't know existed. My work with the unit took me to places that don't appear on regular maps, involved operations that never made the news, and required decisions that kept me awake at night even when they were the right ones. The fat pig my father joked about was planning missions that protected American lives, coordinating with foreign intelligence services, and managing resources that could tip the balance of power in volatile regions. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Dad told his drinking buddies that his daughter pushed papers somewhere in the Navy, I was briefing cabinet members on threats they couldn't discuss in public. While he made jokes about my competence, I was trusted with information that could destabilize governments if it fell into the wrong hands. The disconnect between his perception and reality grew wider with each passing year. I stopped calling home regularly, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Dad would ask if I was still playing sailor, make some comment about military food and my appetite, then hand the phone to Mom for 5 minutes of worried questions about whether I was eating right and staying safe. Neither of them ever asked about my actual work, my responsibilities, or whether I was proud of what I'd accomplished. The final star, the promotion to full admiral, came with a ceremony at the Pentagon. 4 stars on each shoulder, a position that put me among the most senior military leaders in the country. I sat in meetings with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I briefed the Secretary of Defense. My recommendations influenced foreign policy decisions that affected millions of people. The respect I commanded wasn't given out of courtesy. It was earned through decades of proving myself in situations where failure wasn't an option. That night at Dad's poker game, I'd driven down from Washington in civilian clothes, planning to spend a quiet evening with family before catching a flight to Brussels for a NATO conference the next morning. I wasn't there to impress anyone or make statements about my career. I was just a daughter visiting her father, hoping maybe this time the conversation would stay civil. The tattoo was usually hidden under long sleeves or uniform cuffs. But it was warm that evening, and I'd rolled up my sleeves while helping Mom clear dishes before Dad's friends arrived. I never expected anyone in that room to recognize what those simple numbers meant. Chief Collins was just supposed to be another one of Dad's drinking buddies, a retired Navy guy who liked to swap stories about the old days. But when Collins saw that tattoo, everything changed. His expression shifted from casual interest to sharp focus. His posture straightened into something approaching attention. And when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of respect that can't be faked or forced. "Admiral Hayes, ma'am, it's an honor." The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's poker chips sat motionless on the green felt. His friends stared like they were witnessing something impossible. The fat pig he'd introduced to the room wasn't who they thought she was. She wasn't who he thought she was. After 34 years of jokes and dismissal, the truth had finally found its voice. Dad's face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before. Confusion first, like he was trying to solve a math problem that didn't add up. Then disbelief, as if Collins had just claimed I was secretly a movie star. Finally, something that looked almost like fear, the kind that creeps in when you realize you've been wrong about something fundamental for a very long time. "Admiral?" Dad's voice cracked on the word. He looked from Collins to me and back again, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate joke. "She's not an admiral. She works in an office somewhere, files papers or something." Collins remained standing, his military bearing unmistakable now that I was paying attention. 20 years in the Navy leaves marks on a man that civilian clothes can't hide. The way he held his shoulders, the precision of his movements, the respect in his voice when he addressed me. "Sir, with all due respect, Admiral Hayes is one of the most decorated officers in the United States Navy." The poker game had officially ended, though nobody had declared it. Cards lay forgotten on the felt table. Beer bottles sat untouched. The other men in the room, Dad's usual crew of retired mechanics and construction workers, looked like they'd wandered into the wrong movie. This wasn't the script they'd expected when they came over for their weekly game. Mom appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, dish towel still in her hands. She'd heard the commotion and came to investigate. Her eyes moved from the frozen tableau of men around the poker table to me, standing quietly near the door in my rolled-up sleeves and simple jeans. "What's going on?" she asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Mrs. Hayes," Collins said, turning toward her with the same respectful tone, "your daughter is a 4-star admiral in the United States Navy. She commands operations I'm not cleared to discuss, but I can tell you that people with her security level brief the president directly." Mom's dish towel fluttered to the floor. She stared at me like I'd just announced I was from Mars. "4 stars?" she whispered. Like a general?" "Admiral," Collins corrected gently. "Navy equivalent. There are maybe 20 people in the entire military with that rank at any given time." He paused, then added with unmistakable pride, "And your daughter is one of them." The silence stretched out like taffy. Dad sank slowly into his chair, the same worn recliner where he'd spent countless evenings making jokes at my expense while watching television. His face had gone pale, and for the first time in my adult life, he seemed genuinely speechless. No quick comeback, no dismissive joke, no way to reduce what he'd just heard into something manageable. "The tattoo," Collins continued, his voice taking on an educational tone. "Unit 17 is, well, it's classified. But I can say that assignment requires the highest security clearances and the most rigorous psychological evaluations. They don't give those positions to paper pushers." I hadn't spoken since Collins first addressed me. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to confirm or deny what he'd said. Part of me wanted to let the moment stretch out longer, to savor this reversal of everything Dad thought he knew. But another part of me, the part that had learned leadership meant taking responsibility for difficult conversations, knew I needed to speak. "It's true," I said simply. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I've been in the Navy for 34 years, the last 8 as a flag officer." Dad's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "But why didn't you ever tell us?" The question came out strangled, confused. "Would it have mattered?" I asked. The words came out sharper than I intended, but they carried the weight of decades of dismissal. When exactly would have been a good time to bring it up, between the fat jokes and the comments about my incompetence? The room flinched collectively. Collins looked uncomfortable, like he'd stumbled into a family therapy session. Mom's hand went to her throat, a nervous gesture I remembered from childhood. Dad just stared at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that might have been shame. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "How was I supposed to know if you never told me?" "Because you never asked," I replied. "In 34 years, you never once asked what I actually did for a living. You decided I was a failure and stuck with that story no matter what evidence suggested otherwise." Collins cleared his throat delicately. "Sir, if I may," he said to Dad, "Admiral Hayes has served in some of the most challenging positions in the modern military. Her service record is, well, it's the kind of career people write books about." "What kind of positions?" Mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd moved closer, like she was seeing me for the first time. I looked at Collins, who nodded slightly. Even he didn't know the full scope of my assignments, but he understood enough to speak generally. "Operations in the Pacific, Mediterranean, and Middle East," he said. "Logistics coordination for major military actions. Strategic planning at the highest levels. The kind of work that keeps American interests secure around the world." Dad ran his hands through his thinning hair. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. All this time, I thought, you never said anything about... About what? I asked. About the fact that I commanded supply operations for 3 carrier strike groups? About the commendations from the Secretary of Defense? About the fact that I've briefed Congress on matters of national security? Each revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Which part would you have liked me to share during your dinner table comedy routines? The poker buddies were shifting uncomfortably now, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. This had gone way beyond awkward family dynamics into something that felt too intimate, too raw for strangers to witness. But nobody seemed to know how to gracefully exit the situation. Collins, bless him, tried to lighten the mood slightly. Admiral, I have to say, it's an honor to meet you outside of official channels. Your reputation in the special operations community is, well, it's legendary. Special operations? Dad's voice cracked again. He looked like he was trying to process information that didn't fit any framework he understood. I nodded slowly. Among other things. She can't tell you specifics, Collins explained, but Unit 17 handles situations that require the highest level of operational security. The fact that she was selected for that assignment speaks volumes about her capabilities and trustworthiness. Mom had tears in her eyes now. Honey, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Why didn't you ever tell us? We're your parents. We should have known. The question hit harder than Dad's confusion or Collins's revelations, because underneath her words was the assumption that I owed them that knowledge, that my achievements belonged to them somehow, but they'd never earned the right to share in my success. They'd spent decades teaching me that nothing I did would ever be good enough for their approval. Because, I said carefully, every time I tried to share anything about my life, it became a joke. Every promotion, every assignment, every accomplishment got turned into material for Dad's comedy show. So I stopped trying. The weight of that statement settled over the room like fog. These weren't abstract grievances anymore. This was the accumulated damage of thousands of small cruelties, the death by 1,000 cuts that had severed the connection between us long before tonight. Dad was crying now, actual tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. I didn't mean, he started, then stopped. I thought I was just teasing. I thought you knew I didn't mean anything by it. But you did mean it, I said quietly. Every joke, every comment, every time you introduced me as your disappointment to your friends. You meant all of it. And now you're upset because it turns out you were wrong. Collins stepped forward slightly. If I may suggest, he said diplomatically, this might be a conversation better suited to family privacy. He was right, of course. This wasn't something that should be happening in front of an audience, but part of me was glad it was happening this way, with witnesses who could confirm what they'd heard. For 34 years, Dad had made me the entertainment for his social gatherings. Tonight, the entertainment was his reckoning with reality. I think, I said, looking around the room at the uncomfortable faces, that might be best. The poker buddies began gathering their things with the efficiency of men fleeing a natural disaster. Chairs scraped against the floor. Somebody mumbled something about calling it an early night. Within minutes, the living room had emptied except for Collins, who lingered near the door. Admiral, he said formally, thank you for your service. And sir, he added, turning to Dad, you should be proud. Your daughter is exactly the kind of leader this country needs. Then he was gone, leaving the 3 of us alone with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that still needed to be discussed. Dad sat in his recliner, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Mom hovered nearby, unsure whether to comfort him or apologize to me. And I stood by the door, still wearing the simple civilian clothes that had hidden a lifetime of service, wondering if it was possible to rebuild something that had been broken for so long. That had been broken for so long. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that 34 years had carved. Dad sat slumped in his recliner, the same chair where he'd held court for decades, dispensing wisdom and wisecracks in equal measure. Now he looked like a deflated balloon, all the air gone out of him. Mom stood frozen between the kitchen and living room, her hands twisting the dish towel she'd dropped and picked up 3 times. I could have left then. Part of me wanted to walk out that door and drive back to Washington, back to my world where people understood what 4 stars meant, where respect wasn't something you had to fight for every single day. But something kept my feet planted on that worn carpet, something that felt like unfinished business. 34 years, Dad finally whispered, his voice hoarse. 34 years I've been making jokes about my daughter, and she's been out there commanding ships and briefing presidents. Not the whole time, I said quietly. It took a while to work my way up. He looked at me then, really looked, like he was trying to see through decades of willful blindness. When did you make Admiral? The first star, 8 years ago. The 4th star came 2 years back. His face crumpled. 8 years. Jesus Christ, Sarah. 8 years you've been a flag officer, and I've been introducing you as the family disappointment. Mom made a small sound, somewhere between a sob and a gasp. Oh, honey, she said, moving toward me with tentative steps. We had no idea. We're so proud of you. I held up a hand, stopping her mid-stride. Are you really proud, or are you just embarrassed that you didn't know? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Mom's face went through a series of expressions: hurt, confusion, something that might have been recognition. Dad just stared at his hands. I don't know how to fix this, he said finally. I don't know how to take back 34 years of being an ass. You can't, I said simply, but you could start by understanding why I stopped trying to tell you anything. He nodded slowly, like a student accepting a difficult lesson. Tell me. Help me understand. I moved to the couch across from his chair, the same couch where I'd sat as a teenager, listening to him explain why I'd never amount to anything. The irony wasn't lost on me. Do you remember when I graduated from officer candidate school? His brow furrowed. You said you were getting some kind of promotion. I called to tell you I was being commissioned as an ensign. You said, "That's nice, kiddo, try not to sink any ships." Then you handed the phone to Mom. The memory hit him like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged. I thought you were just trying to make your job sound more important than it was. And when I made lieutenant? I don't remember. I called to tell you I'd been selected for department head school. You said, "More schooling? Haven't you learned enough about filing papers yet?" Each example was another nail in the coffin of our relationship, and I could see him understanding that now. Mom had tears streaming down her cheeks, but I wasn't done. When I made commander, I tried to explain that I was being given my own unit. You said the Navy must be desperate if they were putting me in charge of anything. Stop, he said, his voice breaking. Please, stop. But I couldn't stop. 34 years of swallowed pride, of diminished accomplishments, of being treated like a cosmic joke was pouring out of me like water through a broken dam. When I made captain, I called to tell you I was taking command of a logistics operation that supplied 3 battle groups. You said, well, at least you'll know where the cafeteria is. Dad was openly sobbing now, his face in his hands. I'm sorry, he choked out. God almighty, I'm so sorry. And when I made Rear Admiral, when I pinned on my first star, I didn't call at all, because I knew exactly what you'd say. You'd find some way to make it small, to make me small. Mom sank onto the arm of Dad's chair, her hand resting on his shoulder. We didn't know, she whispered. We just didn't know. Because you didn't want to know, I said. Every time I tried to share something real with you, it got turned into comedy material, so I stopped sharing. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the shocked quiet of revelation. This was the heavy quiet of reckoning, of people finally understanding the weight of their choices. Dad lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen. What you said about briefing Congress, about commanding operations, is that really true? I nodded. Among other things. What other things? For the first time in my adult life, he was asking a genuine question about my work. Not setting up a punchline, not dismissing what I might say. Actually asking. I've coordinated humanitarian relief operations in disaster zones. I've managed supply chains that kept coalition forces operational in 3 different theaters. I've sat in situation rooms making decisions that affected thousands of lives. I paused, watching his face process this information. I've done things I can't talk about, in places I can't name, for reasons that will stay classified long after I'm dead. He was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what he'd never bothered to learn. And the whole time, I've been treating you like you were nothing. Not nothing, I said. A joke, your personal entertainment. The family failure who existed to make everyone else feel better about themselves. Mom spoke up, her voice small. You have to understand, honey. You never corrected us. You never said anything. Because I learned early that it didn't matter what I said. You'd already decided who I was. The fat kid who'd never amount to anything. The disappointment you had to tolerate. But you're not fat anymore, Mom said, as if that somehow fixed everything. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Mom, I haven't been overweight since I was 22. But even if I weighed 300 pounds, I'd still be a 4-star admiral who commands more people than live in this entire town. The truth of that statement settled over them like a blanket. Dad looked around the living room, taking in the modest furniture, the family photos, the small-town trappings of their comfortable but unremarkable life. Then he looked at me, seeing for perhaps the first time that his daughter had outgrown this place in ways he'd never imagined. How many people do you command? He asked. Directly, about 50,000. Indirectly, more. His mouth fell open. 50,000 people take orders from you? When necessary, yes. And they respect you? They have to. But most of them do it because I've earned it, not because it's required. He shook his head slowly, like he was trying to dislodge water from his ears. I can't wrap my head around this. My little girl giving orders to 50,000 people. I'm not your little girl, I said quietly. I haven't been anyone's little girl for a very long time. The words hit him like a slap. He flinched, understanding finally that the relationship he thought he had with me had been built on a foundation of delusion. The daughter he'd mocked and dismissed had grown into someone who existed in a world he couldn't comprehend. What happens now? Mom asked. Where do we go from here? It was the question I'd been dreading, because I didn't have a good answer. The damage wasn't something that could be fixed with apologies and good intentions. Trust, once broken, doesn't reassemble itself just because people are sorry they broke it. I don't know, I said honestly. This isn't something we can just move past. Dad wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What if I tried to do better? What if we both tried to do better? Tried to do what better? You don't even know who I am. You've spent so long believing your own story about me that you don't have any idea what doing better would look like. Then teach us, Mom said desperately. Help us understand. I studied their faces, looking for something genuine beneath the shock and regret. They looked smaller than I remembered, older, more fragile. The people who had loomed so large in my childhood, whose approval I'd craved and whose dismissal had shaped me, seemed almost ordinary now. I'm not sure you can learn this, I said. I'm not sure it's possible to unlearn 34 years of thinking your daughter is a failure. But you're not a failure, Dad said urgently. You're the opposite of a failure. You're incredible. Now I'm incredible. 24 hours ago, I was the fat pig you had to live with. The words landed like hammer blows. He winced with each one, understanding finally that this wasn't just about tonight's humiliation. This was about a lifetime of accumulated damage, of small cruelties that had built into something insurmountable. I was wrong, he said. About everything. I was completely wrong. Yes, I agreed. You were. The simple acknowledgement seemed to deflate him further. He'd expected me to soften, to offer forgiveness, to make this easier for him. But I wasn't here to make anything easier. I was here because a Navy SEAL had forced the truth into the open, and now we all had to deal with it. "So, what do you want from us?" Mom asked. "What would it take for us to earn another chance?" I considered the question seriously. What would it take? What could they possibly do to rebuild something that had been so thoroughly destroyed? The answer, when it came to me, was both simple and impossible. "I want you to see me," I said. "Not the daughter you wished you'd had, not the person you think I should be, but who I actually am. And I want you to respect that person, even if she doesn't match whatever picture you had in your head." They nodded eagerly, like students promising to study harder for the next exam. But I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They didn't understand what I was asking because they'd never practiced seeing me as anything other than their disappointing daughter. "And I want you to understand," I continued, "that the person I became despite you, not because of you. The Navy gave me what this family never did, the chance to prove my worth through my actions rather than my appearance." That truth settled over the room like a judgment. They'd failed me in the most fundamental way parents can fail a child. They'd made me feel worthless in my own home, unwelcome in my own family. The fact that I'd overcome that failure didn't absolve them of it. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of traffic on the main road, the ordinary sounds of a small town settling into evening. Inside, 3 people sat with the wreckage of a relationship that might have been salvageable once, but had been left to rot for too long. The question now was whether anything could grow in soil that poisoned. That poisoned owned. Dad wiped his face with trembling hands, leaving streaks across his cheeks like war paint made of regret. The grandfather clock in the corner resumed its steady ticking, marking time in a room where decades of assumptions had just collapsed. Mom clutched her dish towel like a lifeline, her knuckles white against the faded fabric. "I keep thinking," Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper, "about all the times people asked me about you. Neighbors, guys at work, people at church. They'd say, 'How's Sarah doing?' And I'd make some crack about you pushing papers or counting pencils somewhere." He shook his head slowly. I was bragging about not knowing my own daughter's life. The admission hung in the air between us. I could picture those conversations perfectly. Dad holding court at the hardware store or the diner, getting laughs at my expense from people who probably thought less of him for it. The irony was bitter. While he was diminishing my accomplishments to anyone who'd listen, I was sitting in classified briefings where my recommendations influenced foreign policy. "There's something else," I said quietly. "Something you need to understand about the work I do." They both looked at me expectantly, like children waiting for a story they weren't sure they wanted to hear. "The people I serve with, the men and women under my command, they don't care what I looked like in high school. They don't care about family jokes or childhood nicknames. They care about competence, integrity, results. They trust me with their lives because I've earned that trust through 15 years of proving myself in situations where failure meant people died." Dad's face crumpled again. "Jesus Christ, Sarah. People's lives? Combat zones, humanitarian crises, situations where split-second decisions determine whether families get their sons and daughters back home." I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "The fat pig you joked about has been responsible for operations that saved thousands of American lives." Mom made a strangled sound, half sob, half gasp. "We didn't know," she kept repeating. "How could we know?" "Because you could have asked," I said, not unkindly but not softly either. "In 34 years of service, you could have asked one genuine question about what I actually did for a living. Instead, you decided I was incompetent and stuck with that story." The silence stretched, until Dad broke it with a question that surprised me. "Are you happy?" I blinked. "What? Are you happy with your life, your career, the choices you made?" His eyes were red but focused. Because sitting here, realizing what an ass I've been, all I can think is that maybe you're miserable and we never bothered to find out. It was perhaps the first real question he'd ever asked about my inner life. Not about my weight, not about my perceived failures, but about my actual well-being. The unexpectedness of it caught me off guard. "Yes," I said, and the word came out stronger than I expected. "I am happy. I found my purpose, my people, my place in the world. The Navy gave me everything this house never could. Respect earned through merit, not granted through blood." I stood up, feeling the weight of 4 stars that weren't visible but somehow filled the room anyway. I built a life worth living, despite starting in a place that taught me I was worth nothing. Dad nodded slowly, tears still fresh on his cheeks. "Then maybe," he whispered, "maybe that's enough for now." Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who love us least skillfully. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about forgetting, but about refusing to let old wounds poison new possibilities. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving you were right all along, but simply walking away knowing your worth was never theirs to define.